The first time Elena Hartley noticed the silence in her mansion, it was not peaceful but hollow, the kind of silence that echoes back at you like an unanswered question. And she stood in the center of her marble living room, surrounded by everything money could buy: crystal chandeliers imported from Italy, paintings chosen by designers who never asked what she actually liked, furniture that was too perfect to ever feel lived in, and she realized none of it belonged to her in the way it should. Not really, because ownership is not about possession, but about connection, and she felt connected to nothing. Her husband, Victor, had built this life from ambition sharpened into obsession, climbing from nothing into a world where wealth became armor and status became language. And when he married her, he had given her everything except presence, and she had accepted it because that was what rich wives were supposed to do: smile gracefully, host dinners flawlessly, exist beautifully in the background of powerful men. But over time, Elena began to feel like an ornament in her own life, admired but not known, seen but not understood. And she wondered quietly if comfort could become its own kind of prison. The idea of the swap came to her unexpectedly, during a charity gala she had organized but barely remembered planning, surrounded by guests who praised her generosity without ever asking who she was. And she overheard a conversation between two women about a television experiment where families from different economic worlds exchanged lives temporarily, and something about it stirred a feeling she could not name, a mixture of curiosity and desperation. The irrational hope that somewhere beyond the gates of her controlled existence there was something real waiting for her. Victor laughed when she first mentioned it, dismissing the idea as ridiculous, unnecessary, beneath them. But Elena persisted in a quiet way that surprised even herself, because for the first time in years she wanted something that had nothing to do with appearances. And eventually, perhaps out of boredom or confidence that nothing could truly change her, Victor agreed. That was how Elena found herself standing weeks later in front of a narrow apartment building, in a part of the city she had never visited, her designer suitcase in her hand feeling absurdly out of place, her reflection in the glass door looking like a stranger who had wandered into the wrong life. The woman she was swapping with was named Marisol, and she greeted Elena with cautious politeness, her eyes sharp and observant, as if measuring the distance between their worlds in a single glance. And Marisol's home was small but alive in a way Elena's mansion had never been, filled with mismatched furniture, family photographs, and the faint scent of food that lingered in the air like memory. Elena's first night there was restless, not because the bed was uncomfortable, but because everything felt unfamiliar. The sounds of neighbors through thin walls, the hum of appliances she had never noticed before, the absence of staff anticipating her needs before she could even voice them, and she realized with quiet embarrassment that she did not know how to live without being served. The next morning, reality arrived without ceremony. In the form of an alarm clock, she had to silence herself and responsibilities no one would handle for her. And Marisol's schedule was waiting, written neatly on a piece of paper: shifts at a clothing store, bills to be paid carefully and deliberately, groceries to be budgeted with precision Elena had never needed to consider. At the store, Elena struggled immediately, her hands unfamiliar with tasks others performed effortlessly, folding clothes quickly enough, speaking to customers without the protective shield of wealth, and she felt exposed in a way she had never experienced, judged not by her status but by her competence. And she realized how much of her identity had been constructed from external validation rather than internal strength. Customers spoke to her without deference, some impatient, some dismissive, and she felt frustration rise before recognizing it was not cruelty but normalcy, the absence of privilege she had always taken for granted. Days passed, and the exhaustion was physical and emotional, the constant awareness of limits, of choices shaped not by preference but by necessity. And Elena began to understand the quiet courage required to live this way, the resilience built from routine struggle, the dignity and effort no one applauded. She found herself noticing details she had never seen before: the careful way Marisol tracked every expense, the way she stretched resources to ensure stability, the quiet pride she took in maintaining her life without excess. At night, Elena sat alone in the small apartment, thinking about her mansion, its empty perfection, and she realized with startling clarity that wealth had protected her from discomfort, but also from growth, had insulated her from failure, but also from understanding, and for the first time, she questioned whether comfort alone was enough to make a life meaningful. She thought of Victor, of the distance that had grown between them unnoticed, of the role she had played without questioning it, and she wondered whether he would recognize her when she returned, or whether she would even recognize herself. Because something was changing inside her, slowly but irreversibly, the fragile beginnings of empathy, of awareness, of strength she had never needed before, and she understood that this experiment was no longer about curiosity, but transformation, and that when it ended, she would not simply return to her old life unchanged. She would carry this understanding with her, the knowledge of struggle, of effort, of humanity beyond privilege, and whether Victor accepted that change or not, she knew one thing with absolute certainty: she would never again be content to exist as something ornamental in a life she did not truly live. By the end of the first week, Elena's hands no longer looked like her own, the skin dry from harsh soap and constant friction, her nails no longer perfectly shaped, but uneven and real. And she stared at them one night under the dim kitchen light, realizing they were proof of something she had never possessed before: effort, the visible evidence of participation in her own survival. She had spent her entire adult life untouched by inconvenience, her world designed to anticipate her needs before she even recognized them herself. And now, every action required intention, every comfort required sacrifice, and the simplicity of that truth both exhausted and awakened her. The store manager, a tired but observant woman named Leela, had stopped watching Elena with open skepticism and instead offered quiet corrections, showing her how to fold efficiently, how to speak to difficult customers without shrinking, how to endure the long hours on her feet without complaint. And Elena accepted the guidance with humility she had never needed to practice before, because here, her wealth meant nothing, her last name meant nothing, and she was forced to exist without the protective shield of status. One afternoon, a customer snapped at her for a mistake, her voice sharp and impatient, and Elena felt the familiar instinct to defend herself, to assert authority the way she once could with a single word. But she stopped herself, realizing that authority had never truly been hers. It had only belonged to the wealth surrounding her, and now she stood exposed without it, forced to rely on patience instead of power. That night, she returned to the apartment aching in ways she had never experienced, her back sore, her legs trembling, and she sat at the small table reviewing the envelope Marisol had left, the one filled with bills labeled in careful handwriting: rent, electricity, water, each number precise and unavoidable, and Elena felt a tightening in her chest as she calculated the total, realizing how fragile this life was, how easily it could collapse under a single unexpected expense, and she understood with painful clarity that stability here was not guaranteed but earned constantly through vigilance and discipline. She found herself thinking about the casual way she had spent money before, the dresses worn once and forgotten, the dinners that cost more than a month of Marisol's groceries, and shame settled over her not because she had been rich, but because she had been unaware of the distance between comfort and survival, unaware of the invisible labor sustaining lives beyond her own. Victor called her occasionally, his voice amused, curious in a detached way, asking how she was managing, and she could hear the unspoken assumption beneath his questions, that this experience was temporary entertainment, a novelty she would eventually abandon, and she answered carefully, telling him enough to satisfy his curiosity, but not enough to reveal the truth, that she was changing in ways he would not understand. One evening, as she walked home carrying groceries she had chosen with deliberate restraint, she saw a mother and child sitting on the curb nearby, sharing a single packaged meal, their movements quiet and uncomplaining, and Elena felt something inside her fracture. Not pity, but recognition. The realization that struggle was not rare or exceptional, but constant and ordinary for so many people she had never truly seen before. When she reached the apartment, she placed her groceries on the counter and stood there for a long time, staring at them, understanding that each item represented choice, sacrifice, calculation. And she felt a strange sense of pride knowing she had earned them herself. She began to sleep differently, deeper and heavier, her exhaustion grounding her in her own body, and she noticed her thoughts changing too, becoming clearer, less distracted by trivial concerns, more focused on meaning rather than appearance. But with that clarity came discomfort, because she began to see her old life not as perfect but as incomplete, a carefully curated illusion sustained by distance from reality. And she wondered whether Victor had ever truly known her, or whether he had simply loved the version of her that existed within his controlled world. She found herself dreading their next conversation, not because she feared his anger, but because she feared his indifference, feared the possibility that he would never understand why this experience mattered, why it had begun to reshape her from the inside. Late one night, unable to sleep, she walked to the small window overlooking the street and watched the city moving without her. People returning from late shifts, lights flickering in distant buildings, lives unfolding in quiet resilience, and she realized that for the first time, she was not observing life from behind glass but standing within it, vulnerable and present. And though the uncertainty frightened her, it also filled her with something she had never felt before: purpose. The fragile but undeniable awareness that she was no longer merely existing inside a life designed by someone else. She was beginning, slowly and painfully, to build one of her own. Victor Hartley had always believed control was the same thing as strength, and for most of his life, the world had rewarded that belief without question. Doors opening before him, people adjusting themselves around his expectations, reality bending quietly to accommodate his certainty. And when he entered Elena's world, the world she had temporarily left behind, it did not occur to him that he might be the one unprepared. The mansion greeted him with its usual perfection, every surface polished, every detail maintained, but without Elena, something fundamental was missing. Something he could not name but felt immediately. A subtle disorder beneath the immaculate presentation, as if the house itself recognized the absence of the person who had given it meaning. At first, Victor treated the experience like a performance, playing the role expected of him with effortless confidence, hosting meetings, attending social events, answering questions with rehearsed charm, and yet he began to notice small failures accumulating beneath the surface, details Elena had always managed without his awareness, relationships she had maintained, conversations she had navigated, emotional balances she had preserved. And he realized with quiet irritation that wealth alone did not sustain the delicate ecosystem of their social world. It required attention, intuition, and care he had never needed to develop himself. Invitations became colder, interactions more transactional, and he sensed a shift in how people responded to him. Not disrespect, but distance, as if Elena's absence had removed something essential he could not replicate. Meanwhile, Elena's name continued to appear in conversations, spoken with warmth and familiarity he had never inspired himself, and he felt an unfamiliar sensation creeping into his thoughts, something dangerously close to insecurity. He called her more often now, his curiosity sharpening into something heavier, and her voice had changed in ways he could not fully understand. Quieter but steadier, stripped of the soft dependence he had unconsciously relied upon, and each conversation left him unsettled, aware that the version of Elena he had known was slipping beyond his reach. One evening, alone in the vast dining room, Victor sat at the long table, met for 12, and ate in silence, the emptiness around him no longer comforting but oppressive, and he realized with growing discomfort that wealth had always shielded him from loneliness, disguising it beneath constant motion and distraction. But now, without Elena's quiet presence filling the spaces between his ambitions, the silence felt heavier than it ever had before. At the same time, Elena was changing in ways neither of them had anticipated. Her days filled with effort and learning and exhaustion that grounded her in reality, and she began to notice a growing distance, not only from Victor, but from the version of herself she had once been. The woman who had accepted comfort without question, who had measured her worth through his approval, and she wondered whether returning to that life was even possible anymore. One afternoon, Marisol called her unexpectedly, her voice cautious but sincere, asking how Elena was managing. And during their conversation, Marisol admitted something that unsettled Elena deeply, that Victor had not adjusted easily, that he struggled with the emotional responsibilities Elena had always handled effortlessly, that he appeared more isolated now than Elena had ever seen him before, and the realization forced Elena to confront a truth she had never considered, that Victor's strength had always depended on her presence, on her quiet labor sustaining the life he claimed as his own. That night, Elena lay awake in the small apartment, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts heavy with contradiction, because she had spent years believing Victor was the foundation of her world. But now she began to understand that she had been the foundation of his, invisible but essential. And that knowledge filled her with both anger and clarity. She realized then that the swap had not only exposed her to struggle, but had exposed the fragile illusion beneath their marriage, revealing the imbalance she had never fully seen. And she understood that when the experiment ended, she would face a choice far greater than returning to comfort. She would have to decide whether she could remain in a life where her value had never been truly understood, or whether she would have the courage to demand something more, something real, even if it meant walking away from everything she had once believed defined her. The day Elena returned to the mansion, it did not feel like coming home, but like stepping into a memory preserved too carefully. Every surface exactly as she had left it, every object frozen in place as if waiting for her to resume the role she had quietly abandoned, and she stood in the center of the living room once more, remembering the woman who had stood there weeks before, surrounded by wealth but emptied of purpose. And she realized with quiet certainty that she was no longer that woman. Victor was waiting for her, his posture rigid, his expression carefully controlled, but his eyes betrayed him, revealing the uncertainty he could no longer conceal. And for a moment neither of them spoke, because silence had always been their safest language, the place where uncomfortable truths could remain unspoken. He stepped toward her slowly, as if approaching someone unfamiliar, and said her name, not with authority, but hesitation. And she heard in his voice something she had never heard before: vulnerability. They sat together in the vast room that had once defined their life, and he began to speak, explaining his experience in fragments, the social expectations he had struggled to navigate, the quiet isolation he had felt even surrounded by privilege, and Elena listened without interruption, noticing how different he seemed without his usual certainty, how exposed he was without the invisible support she had always provided. When he finished, he asked her the question he had been avoiding since her return, whether she was ready for things to go back to normal, and she understood then that normal had never truly existed. It had only been a structure built on assumptions neither of them had questioned. She told him the truth, not with anger but clarity, explaining what she had learned, how struggle had reshaped her understanding of herself, how living without wealth had forced her to discover strengths she had never needed before, and most importantly, how she had realized her identity could not remain confined within the boundaries of his world. Victor listened in silence, his expression shifting from confusion to realization, and she saw the moment he understood that this was not a temporary transformation, but a permanent one. He asked her what she wanted now, and the question hung between them heavier than anything he had ever said, because for the first time, the answer did not revolve around him. Elena took a long breath, feeling the weight of her decision not as fear but as responsibility, and she told him she wanted a life built on partnership rather than dependence, a life where her voice carried equal weight, where her purpose extended beyond maintaining appearances, and she saw in his face the painful recognition that he had never truly given her that before. He apologized then, not defensively but sincerely, admitting he had never understood the quiet labor she had carried for years, the emotional foundation she had provided without acknowledgement, and she believed him, not because his words erased the past, but because his vulnerability revealed a truth he had never allowed himself to see before. But forgiveness, she realized, was not the same as restoration, and understanding did not guarantee change. She stood and walked toward the window, looking out at the city beyond the gates, the world she had once observed only from a distance, and she thought about the apartment, the store, the exhaustion and struggle that had forced her to discover herself, and she understood that she could not return fully to the person she had been before. When she turned back to Victor, her voice was steady, and she told him she was not leaving him, but she was no longer staying for the same reasons. She was staying by choice, not comfort. And that choice came with conditions, honesty, equality, and freedom to exist beyond the role he had once assigned her. Victor nodded slowly, understanding that their marriage would no longer be defined by wealth or habit, but by effort, and that effort would require him to become someone new as well. In the weeks that followed, Elena began to reshape her life deliberately, involving herself in work that mattered to her, maintaining connections beyond their social circle, building an identity independent of Victor's shadow, and though the mansion remained unchanged physically, it no longer felt like a prison, because its meaning had changed. She understood now that wealth was not the enemy but ignorance was, and she refused to live blindly again. Sometimes she still thought about the woman she had been before the swap, the woman who believed comfort was enough, and she did not judge her, because that woman had not yet known her own strength. Standing once more in the center of her home, Elena realized that the true transformation had never been about exchanging wealth for struggle, but about exchanging dependence for awareness. And for the first time in her life, she was not defined by the world she lived in, but by the person she had become within it, a woman who had seen both sides of existence and chosen, finally, to live with her eyes open.